Hello, listeners, and welcome to the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday, and indeed just me, as this is another one of our special podcast episodes, this time recorded live at the recent Annecy Animation Festival that took place in a very warm France in early June, where I was invited to speak on a panel as part of the Annecy International Animation Film Market, or MIFA. As I'm sure many of you know, the Annecy International Animation Film Festival is one of the most popular and prestigious events in the animation calendar. It was created back in 1960 and stands today as an annual celebration of all things animation, from features and shorts to animated television, advertising, and student films. Premiere screenings, special guests, interviews sit alongside open air night projections in the centre of the town, right by the lake and with the mountains for view. It's a spectacular place, and I was very lucky to get to go. Now, MIFA is the more industry-leaning arm, I guess, of Annecy, where attendees can meet exhibitors, buyers, investors, make contacts, network, and discuss animation projects and productions with professionals. The conversation you're about to hear is a recording of the Animation Without Borders, Navigating the Imperative of Global Appeal panel. It was moderated and organised by Juliette Rogasik, the founder and creative director of Story Critters, a New York-based animation consulting firm that, as their website advertises, helps animation studios develop highly engaging animated content tuned into the cultural diversity of a globalised market. Now, you'll first hear Juliette's short introduction that also features Emmy Award-winning writer Scott Gray, where they talk about Kepir, an award-winning first-of-its-kind initiative rallying the kids' media community in aid of refugee children worldwide. Then we launch into the panel discussion itself that featured Sarah Cox, Chief Creative Director at Aardman, Peilin Chou, producer at Netflix Animation, and myself representing Fantasy Animation. Now, you'll hear more from Juliette shortly about who we are and the aims of the panel, but please do sit back and enjoy this conversation, really lively conversation that took in the cross-cultural challenges and opportunities when animated productions try and reach global audiences, whilst at the same time seeking to preserve that kind of cultural specificity. So thanks to Juliette for bringing us all together and for the questions and the engagement from the live audience who came along. I'm actually told that we were scheduled at the same time as a presentation by Wes Anderson, so we're really grateful to those that came along. Anyway, enjoy.
Bonjour à tous et bienvenue à Annecy. Welcome everybody. I'm so excited to welcome here such a wonderful panel of experts. Please help me welcome on stage Sarah Cox. Sarah sits on the board of directors at Aardman Animations. She's the studio's chief creative director, and she's brought a range of projects to the Aardman roster, including the beloved Christmas musical Robin Robin, Oscar nominated. She's a voting member of BAFTA, and her previous works and independent shorts received multiple BAFTA nominations, British Animation Awards, and International Film Awards. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you for joining us. Next to Sarah, we have Peilin Chou. Peilin is an Academy Award-nominated filmmaker with an overall deal at Netflix Animation. Peilin was previously Chief Creative Officer of Pearl Studio China. Her producing credits include Over the Moon by Glenn Keane, Oscars, Golden Globe, Children's BAFTA nominated. And her DreamWorks successes are Kung Fu Panda, Abominable, among others, Kung Fu Panda 3. And before that, she was creative executive at Disney and helped shepherd dozens of features, including Mulan. Welcome, Sarah. Welcome, Peilin. Thank you for joining us. And last but not least, Dr. Christopher Holliday from my alma mater. Chris has a PhD in film studies from King's College London. He's a lecturer in liberal arts and visual cultures education at King's College London. He's the author of The Computer Animated Film Industry, Style, and Genre, the first academic work to examine the computer animated feature as a global phenomenon of popular cinema. He's also the co-editor of the anthologies Fantasy/Animation, Connections Between Media, Mediums, and Genre, and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, New Perspectives on Production, Reception, and Legacy. All in all, Chris is here to keep us intellectually in check, and that's what he also does for us at Story Critters. Welcome, Chris. Oh, I realized, I think it's over there, the little click. Thank you. Apologies. So before we start, I'd like to quickly call on stage Scott Gray, Emmy Award-winning writer, there you are. Emmy Award-winning writer for beloved kids series, Rugrats, Paw Patrol, Sesame Street. Scott and I are on the board of directors of an amazing organization called Keeper, Kids Entertainment Professionals for Young Refugees. We could not be here at Annecy talking about children's films from all over the world without talking about those who do not have access to fun. So we thought we'd start with a quick shout out to Keeper as our community's organization. All yours, Scott. Oh, yeah, here.
Thank you, everyone. I'll make this brief. Thanks, Juliette. Annecy has graciously granted us a few minutes at the start of this to address, children, the refugee crisis right now. So I flew all the way out from LA to talk for 3 minutes to everybody. No, I didn't. I have meetings here too. But Keeper, I'll tell you a little bit about it. It's Kids Entertainment Professionals for Young Refugees. It's a grassroots all-volunteer organization. We started in 2017. We're a UNICEF partner. I'm using a cheat sheet here because I didn't sleep for 28 hours straight yesterday. So we've raised hundreds of thousands of dollars since 2017. Right now in the world, there are 50 million forcibly displaced children. That can be war, that can be ethnic cleansing, that can be a natural disaster, but 50 million children are forcibly displaced right now, and that is more than the population of all of Spain. So it's a big crisis. It always has been. It's just getting worse, it seems sometimes. About 1 out of every 40 children in the world is a refugee right now, or forcibly displaced. So I joined Keeper to give back. I know those of us who write and work in children's media, we love the delight we see on a kid's face when they see our work. It's even better when you can directly help them, with their lives in general. So that's kind of what Keeper is about. We're made up of executives, writers, artists. Every person in the industry, involved in the industry, is part of Keeper. So June is special because it's Refugee Awareness Month. That is always the case. And so we do an annual fundraiser called Kindred Spirits every June. This year it's in benefit of the Rohingya crisis. So some of you were lucky enough to get one of our flyers. We ran out of them on the chairs. So, oh yes, the QR code is on the screen for those of you who don't have the flyers on your chair. And if donations are welcome, we also just want people to increase awareness of the refugee crisis with kids and awareness of our organization. So please scan the code, get some more information on Keeper, check us out. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. Big round of applause for Scott and for anyone who is scanning our QR code right now. Let's make a difference in these kids' lives. We are the kids animation industry and the broader entertainment industry as well. So let's kick things off with a quiz. Who in this room at the #1 animation conference in the world can be certain to know who this character is, what movie he's from? Raise of hands. Okay, so out of a room of 100 animation experts, industry professionals, no one's raising their hands. What if I told you that this movie is from, this character is from the world's 6th highest grossing animated film of the last 5 years? $726 million in a single country, domestically at its local box office. It's Shang Shenyun from Naja, Little Cloud, as he does not like to be called. So the reason that many of us in this room do not know this character and maybe less familiar with this movie is because it made most of its revenue in its local country, in China. And that is the core of what we're going to discuss today with our panel. So just to give a quick introduction to who we are at Story Critters, a few minutes to share. We're a cross-cultural development consulting firm based in New York City, and we focused exclusively on advising animation studios around the world on adapting animated TV series and films to a global audience. The way we do it is we deploy over 40 industry professionals from dozens of countries around the world who have a multicultural sensibility and at least 10 years experience in the industry. And with a deep, our process is rooted in a deep comparative literature, comparative storytelling, and film studies framework. So why we exist? Very quickly, the industry right now is a $400 billion industry, and it's set to double in the next 8 years. So that's wonderful, but if you're a Western production, not because we're not counting Naja, it's very difficult to reach north of 400 to 500 million without a massive international success. As you can see, Frozen got only a third of its staggering $1.5 billion in the US alone, and the rest is due to successes in small international regions and broadly all over the world. Imagine if Naja had had the same international success as Frozen, where it would be. And this is true for any content production. It's strategic. You don't have to be Pixar or DreamWorks yet. Maxime Saada's quote here really highlights that this is the key to getting the funds. What do the ones funding you want? And it's extremely difficult to achieve. So let's just trigger the discussion with a few of the themes that we are going to discuss today at our panel. So first, start early, before it's too late. This is the amazing Audi e-tron, $12 billion investment, but they forgot to check what it means in France. Oh la la. I'm not going to say it, but it's not fancy. Oops. Secondly, and I'm so glad to have Sarah and Peilin to discuss this today, stay true to your culture and bring in universal themes. The unexpected success of a series with a deep, deep Spanish cultural core like Casa del Papel was a global phenomenon, despite the fact that it stayed very true to Spanish culture, and it's very Spanish. I mean, there's merchandise, it's a huge success, and in 2021 it was almost 80% higher than demand for the average show, and it surpassed Game of Thrones. Again, stay true to your culture. The Lion King, the story of a young royal who exiles himself after the death of a loved one, tries to find an end to the worries of life, and then returns home, remembering his duty to his people. $7.8 billion generated by the franchise between the Disney 1994 movie and the Broadway show. And actually, to show you how universal this is, the story, as I've just described it, is not The Lion King. It's a 4,000-year-old tale, the tale of Gilgamesh, and it is the oldest written story in humanity. Okay, I'm going to pass on the fact that this is another exiled royal who wants to let it go, but here the themes that really made this a universal success was not the love story, the wars, the battles, not even the adventure. Disney's been trying to adapt Hans Christian Andersen's The Snow Queen since the 30s. It's about the power of sisterhood, the love between two young children that anybody, any child in the world and their parents can relate to. I love this image because we have here on the left, I suppose it's maybe Ohio, and then here we have the Karen Longneck tribe of Myanmar, also in love with Frozen. So let's discuss. Okay, so we're going to start off with the most well-known issue when it comes to cross-cultural storytelling and successful cross-cultural storytelling, humor. So when it comes to translating culturally specific humor and situational humor, Sarah, this is Aardman's forte, as we all know. How do you do it? What has been your experience in developing comedy for a global audience?
Okay, so I probably need a microphone. Yeah, good start, good comedy start. Talking about Wallace and Gromit, seeing as Wallace is up there on the screen, it's, I think the success of Wallace and Gromit globally was probably quite a surprise to Nick Park and Aardman originally, and if we pitched this show now, this is what we always think. If we pitched it now, I doubt we would get it commissioned, because it's a middle-aged man and his dog who live in a small northern town in the UK, and the adventures that they have are very small. They're on a small scale. It's not big dragon killing, knights and armor. It's little adventures. So, it is perhaps surprising that it's so successful, but I think the key to it is the relatability and the absolute detail and observational comedy, I think, is where Aardman really excels. We look at human behavior and we study it and we reflect it, and because we're looking at the world around us, we're based in the UK, in the west of the country, and we study little human frailties and little hiccups and little missteps and accidents, and we very carefully replay those out in our films. So it's noticing those small details, and because we're observing where we are and who's around us, so that becomes naturally, culturally very specific and very authentic. And even though maybe if you're from a completely different continent, you wouldn't recognize any of those specific details, you might appreciate that it's true and authentic, and therefore you sort of trust the comedy, trust the story, you feel that it's real like you, or you might have tripped over in that way, or you might talk to your dog like Wallace talks to Gromit in that way, and sometimes you might see your dog look back at you with that questioning look. So there's universal themes, even though we're very specific. And Nick Park, who was presenting the latest Wallace and Gromit, said that today. He got asked a very similar question: why is Wallace and Gromit so popular? And he said it's because there's pet lovers across the globe, and everyone can relate to that relationship. So it's being specific, but also being really broad and global at the same time.
Yeah, finding those aspects of humanity that we all relate to, and the humor that we can all understand, while bringing in aspects of your own culture to the forefront. Peilin, what about you in your experience and your career and the works that you've helped shepherd that have been so successful and hilarious?
Well, I'll speak to Kung Fu Panda 3, actually, since you have it up on the screen. And I totally echo what Sarah said in terms of the universal themes of it. I mean, I think one of the reasons Kung Fu Panda, the whole franchise, was so successful is because the panda was an ultimate underdog. And, just conceptually, pandas, which are known for being kind of lazy animals, doing Kung Fu, I think, is inherently just kind of funny that they could do that. One of the aspects of humor, I think, that translates most easily globally, apart from universal themes, is just physical comedy and physical humor, because you look at it and it does not have a language besides its physicality, and so that helped it go a long way. But Kung Fu Panda 3 is actually a really interesting case study because given the success of 1 and 2 in China, we did something really special for it, which is that we hyper-localized it for China. So there was a whole version of the movie that was created specifically to make it as appealing as possible to China. And the extremes of it include that they reanimated all the speaking for the entire film into Mandarin. So it was a whole separate version of the film in addition to the original that was done in English. And in the Mandarin version, I would say there were probably 70 to 80 completely different jokes that were not in the original version, and referencing very specific local humor and jokes, and even like modern current trends were dropped in kind of like 3 or 4 months before the film came out. So I think given its history of success in China and how big the market is, as you showed with Neza, there was a lot of interest in that, really kind of making sure the humor was super, super local.
And we're just on the topic of Kung Fu Panda 3 locally in China. I know that there's a huge fan base for the movie, for the franchise. Has it felt to local audiences very culturally, sort of showcasing national identity from a national humor standpoint? Has it been kind of incorporated in pop culture in China, thanks to that successful merging of both universal humor and culturally specific?
Yeah, I mean, the film was really successful, and I think that, we don't ever truly know why when a film is that successful, but that is the belief of why that it resonated in that way, because there was such effort made to cater to that. But I will say the sentiment of China about Kung Fu Panda in general is, gosh darn, why didn't we make that ourselves? So, I think that's a compliment.
And Chris, does the idea of national humor, cultural situational humor play into the construction of national identity from an academic perspective, or maybe the reconstruction, constantly, which is a theme in academia that we hear of a lot, throughout the ages and continuing today despite globalization?
Yeah, it's funny we're talking about humor because I'm an academic that's going to bring the mood right down. So I guess the way this plays out, the idea of the national and some of the things that you were saying about localization, a text that moves across borders. So this is something I'm really interested in. I wear sort of 2 hats. I teach film and media studies. So I teach kind of national cinemas, thinking about the role of the national, thinking about that kind of tension between the local and the global, and then also thinking about sort of where those 2 ideas might overlap in quite kind of problematic or really productive ways. So ways in which I guess film and media studies has thought about ideas around kind of like the glocal or transnational, so transnational cinemas, and then the different ways in which scholars have tried to identify filmmakers who might move across, films move, but people move too, and the idea that sort of filmmakers might themselves be kind of quote unquote accented in the way that they produce a particular film that is informed by their sort of life experience. But I also teach animation, and thinking and telling and talking to my students about sort of animation as this sort of medium that's perfect for small details, exactly that you were kind of saying, a medium that is fundamentally sort of like rhetorical, so it kind of commits to an idea of something, because if it didn't, the page would be blank or the screen would be blank or there'd be no model. So it commits to a kind of general consensus of what we think national identity is, or nationhood is, or Britishness is, or Chineseness is. So given animation is sort of a constructed medium, and one could argue that the idea of the national is itself constructed, it seems perfect that animation is a space that can kind of stage some of these questions around national identity, and I guess national identities that are in flux. But I see humour certainly as part of a broader conversation around kind of cultural specificity, national specificity, the way that national as a category is sort of unstable or has been destabilised. But at the same time, we're not all global, and there is a sort of an embodied and experiential sense of what national identity is. People feel quite close to their national identity. It drives politics. You know, it does all of these things. But I think I'm certainly interested in exactly what you were saying, this idea of sort of hyper-localization, the way that texts can move across these borders in really kind of playful and really interesting ways, actually, the way in which texts can be reanimated, localized, whilst at the same time striking that really important balance exactly with that specificity against broader themes that are sort of, I guess, animation's deep structures. You have the sort of, you know, films don't have surfaces, but there's a sort of sense in which there's a really important double register between the kind of culturally specific and I guess the universally understood.
Yeah, and it's in a way constantly rewritten. We're constantly rewriting our nation's histories. We're rewriting our humor. We'll only really know about 1,000 or so, well, maybe not now with social media, but personally very deeply know 1,000 people from our culture and from our our home country, and yet we have this constructed idea of, and it's of course enhanced by watching films, watching national cinema.
Well, given these two posters are sort of staring at me from the screen, it is interesting that obviously animation absorbs, but it also kind of gives back. And that I think is really interesting, you know, media, cultural products, the ways in which these texts take from traditions or rituals or customs, or the way people think about Britishness and accents and voice and different kinds of traditions, but then also sort of solidifies them and then gives them back to us. And that, you know, that again, I think relates to part of these films clearly quite high levels of appeal.
Right, thank you. And these are really just illustrative, to bring about what topics we're roughly on, but of course we can deviate. I'd love to touch upon how we bring new cultural stories into the limelight and help, have them attain mainstream acceptance. Because we've seen the US animation industry really, I'd say, create a form of cinema where its culture becomes exportable. A lot of studios try to emulate American filmmaking, American plot structures, and but it's interesting to see that, of course, any culture, is able to achieve the same. The question is how. So I'd like to dig deeper into this topic, strategies for global reception. You have vast experience creating content that brings cultural stories and modes of storytelling into the limelight, British culture, Chinese culture, as well as, of course, working on animated features that are US, not only co-productions. And so, what would be from a creative direction point of view? Sarah, what are your insights on how to achieve this global adoption of a new cultural form of storytelling? I mean, you've brought stop motion animation to the forefront. It's a phenomenal achievement what Aardman has done, and at the same time, it's accessible for everyone. So, any insights you have from a creative point of view?
I think one thing Aardman is known for as well is we kind of spoof those big Hollywood genres. So Chicken Run is a sort of Ocean's 11 kind of spoof, but it's very much from a British perspective. And the characters aren't really that super heroic. They're a bit more human, a bit more relatable, a bit more underdoggy. And, again, referencing Nick Park and Wallace and Gromit, there's a moment that was a little trailer this morning that he talked about, that he referenced Cape Fear. So these films that people that are sort of in the global consciousness or the dominant US consciousness, we do our British take on them. It's that thing where you think, but when did they go to the toilet? When did they eat? It's those sort of thoughts when you've got a superhero mid-action and, powering forward. I think we think about the human take, and that's, I suppose part of the British identity. And when I say British, it is the people that are around us who come from all over the world, but it's being a sort of small island, being English speakers but not US, we often look at a sort of off a fringe identity, and Wallace and Gromit is the north of the UK. It's not London. There's a little bit of a step back and look at culture attitude, not being the dominant culture. So I think that's maybe a different approach from a sort of US-China sort of take.
Yes, Peilin, do you have anything to add from your experience?
Sure. I mean, I think that when we take on kind of something that was specifically culturally Chinese, we really try to think about what elements we could bring that would give a viewer that knows nothing about the culture or the specific folktale that we're based on an entry point into the movie. So, for example, Over the Moon is the story of the moon goddess, which is a 1,000-year-old Chinese folktale. I must have been pitched 343 versions of that over the years. But it was this one that was about a modern-day girl that wanted to build a rocket to go meet this moon goddess. I think the one that we felt like, oh, this is something that is going to be more relatable and accessible. And the problem with telling the moon goddess tale was always like, what's this 1,000-year-old, very dusty feeling tale, and why is anyone even going to care? But I think having that element really helped kind of, particularly with children as well, kind of be able to see themselves in the story. Similarly, I would say with Monkey King, we also created a young female protagonist who is not in the original folktale at all. We just invented her as a foil to the Monkey King, and also as an entry point into the film, so that if you knew nothing about it, you could see the world through her point of view and follow her and root for her and be able to enjoy the film just as much as somebody that knew it from birth. And actually, she served a double purpose, because if you were someone that knew it from birth, she is like a brand new element in it that you had never seen before. So one of the thrilling things about both of those films that when they played on Netflix, at Netflix we get a lot of data, so we know exactly who's watching and exactly how many minutes they watch, was that outside of Asia, they were actually super, super popular in South America, which was so surprising to the filmmaking team because we had no idea. But there's theories about because the strong emphasis on family and that culture are similar to China and other elements like that. So that's what we're trying to achieve.
Oh yeah, that's so interesting when you see a theme or a core value in a part of the world you hadn't thought of, where that was actually also very core. It's like the success of the Pixar film Elemental in South Korea, where the values of the film, the way the story was presented, really resonated. And I think 1 out of 8 children in South Korea has seen it. Whereas in the U.S., locally in the U.S., it did well after then with streaming. But originally, it seemed that it had way more appeal in South Korea, which was interesting to see.
Well, one of the filmmakers was Korean American.
Yes,
so
that's why he
yeah.
brought in his a lot of his culture
perspective.
into
Yeah.
But then that shows that his core experience from his Korean heritage and the values he learned as a child, and the ways of seeing that end up transpiring into the film really did help make that a success. It's one of those examples where you really see that's the story there.
For sure.
It's not distribution. It's not well.
I'll share something that's maybe a little controversial. That's kind of the opposite of that, which is one of the other strategies that we very intentionally took on both Over the Moon and Monkey King, was that we had directors that were not from the culture, paired with legions of people that were, myself included on the producing side, because we really felt like it's such a great lens to have someone that didn't grow up with that didn't have it all their lives, and if it was going to be relatable and meaningful to them, then it would hopefully speak globally. And so I'm not advocating for obviously not having people in the culture involved. And there were, as I said, in both films, dozens and dozens of people that were involved. But that was kind of an interesting perspective.
Yes, it is. Chris, from your work, on in animation history and generally your, historical academic perspective on the way that we take myths and bring them mainstream through these films, myths that we grow up with, or that nationally we grow up with, but that become international successes through the medium of animation. Do you have anything to add in that regard?
Well, I think, the idea of kind of mainstreaming, certainly going back through animation history, part of that mainstreaming is very closely connected, I think, to animation's kind of legitimacy, or the legitimizing of animation as a kind of art form, but ultimately an industrial art form. But it kind of makes me think of a particular kind of style, and the way that animation aesthetics, certainly the way that animation historians think about animation style and animation aesthetics, is to kind of splinter off animation into, experimental. So experimental animation becomes animation's other, because it's the periphery to a particular kind of way of seeing the world that is considered, that is sort of founded really in the 20s and 30s by a studio like Disney, but then sets the template for how animation aesthetics, mainstream commercial animation aesthetics, looks for the next 100 years. So if you think about, anything, I don't want to, there's not really such thing as a Disney formula, but the idea of the way that the characters look, or the way that the characters kind of behave, strategies of representation, the rise of kind of personality animation in the kind of 10s and 20s, the idea that animation moves from a novelty to kind of characterization, that there are characters that think and feel and have subjectivity and make bad decisions but make great decisions, and all these sorts of things. The rise of the personality in the formation of character, I think, is kind of crafted in these 20s and 30s period, and then they're the things, the personality, they're the kind of details, I think, that are the culturally specific details, but there are also these universal ways of behavior and awkwardness and things that we all experience that really have their roots in the way that animation was sort of crafted to be this art form in the kind of 20s and 30s. The outcome of that, as I said, is that you get experimental animation, which is sort of a bit more interpretive, non-figurative, but you also get what has been called kind of orthodox animation, which is that commitment to a certain kind of emotional or experiential verisimilitude that accompanies a kind of what we call kind of hyper-realist aesthetic of Disney that influenced Pixar and DreamWorks and Aardman. But of course, what I'm dealing with in one conversation, we're dealing with cell, and we're dealing with computers, and we're dealing with stop motion. So I think there's obviously kind of gradations to this, but I find it kind of interesting that a way to bring cultural stories is to sort of, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but to sort of commit to a particularly familiar way of representing characters and, hyper-realist situations, and then maybe embellishing that. Certainly the Kung Fu Panda films play with that expressivity a lot more, and so I find that sort of animation aesthetics is a really important way that audiences, and I think children as well, look at a film and go, oh yeah, that kind of looks like a film I recognize, and that's a really good way of I suppose broadening your audience and getting people to maybe watch something that they wouldn't normally watch if it's not for them, if we're talking about kind of accidental audiences.
Right, yeah, and we're seeing the Pixar style influence a lot of the routes into which new animation industries around the world are entering into.
Well, that's the foundation, one and only plug for my book, but that is the foundation of my book. The self-similarity within Hollywood. It comes from a kind of technical, it comes from software, it comes from Pixar creating software and then essentially licensed it. So a lot of these films kind of have the characters look and feel the same. They've got that kind of like that glow under the surface. So I think I'm really interested in self-similarity, not as something that's reductive, but something that's really generative to the way that we can kind of think about the landscape of contemporary animation, certainly in the digital sense.
I would argue, though, you used the term accidental audience. I would think that no studio would say it was accidental.
No, but it goes back to your point about Elemental and having an audience that perhaps wasn't the initial target, but ended up the film being really popular. Because that made me think about there's the intentional way of sort of marketing Britishness, and then there's the kind of accidental way that the director doesn't necessarily, or the writers, given that animation is such a collaborative
Sure.
whether or not these are unconscious or then there's a difference between maybe the way that Aardman creates a particular kind of Britishness and a British variation on something versus maybe accidental is the way, but sort of unintended or surprising ways that actually part of the reason these films did so well in particular parts of the world was there was an unknown set of relationships between characters that maybe then played up. So that I think. So I guess my.
No, I agree. I was just giving you a hard time from like a studio marketing perspective. Like,
Thanks.
no, of course we thought South Korea was going to be huge.
Thanks for giving me a hard time in front of a room full of people. But no, but
Is that why we're here?
no, but I think my kind of question that was brewing as you were talking was whether or not those entry points, those kind of surprising entry points that you said that the kind of one of the directors is sort of from the culture. I just wondered that sort of the unintentional, because that I think is really interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I'd say with the way Pixar came into the global landscape, it was a bunch of really talented, very funny, creatives who told stories that were very American in their style, the humor, but it clicked. It just resonated around the world. If you look at, The Incredibles franchise, it's American, office and family culture, but the way it's done is with such a fine attention to those universalities in families and in the love between a family and the jokes that can come out of that they've, I'd say, in a way you could say that it's accidentally clicked with everybody around the world, this type of humor and of storytelling and the American culture, again reiterated, but in a very, very new way to what we'd seen with Disney. So it is a mix, I suppose.
Well, in something like The Incredibles, of course, you've got the idea of in the early years of Pixar, people didn't know really who Pixar were because they focused on short films and they focused on adverts, really. And obviously they have then the clout of Disney after signing a deal, I think, in '91. So they have a bit of sort of industry backing. But at the same time, the most interesting things about something like The Incredibles, obviously the superhero genre is kind of universally, genres come in and out of fashion. They're kind of not ahistorical. They're really historically contingent. People love things and then hate them and then love them. So they kind of come in and out of fashion. But the most interesting things about The Incredibles are the bits around like the dining room table. They're the most interesting things, I think, of the film. I mean, the film's fantastic in lots of ways, but I think you're right, yeah, the sort of family.
Then again, it's another, this idea of what's universally human. You could have as much action and battles and coolness as you want in a movie, and now with the accessibility of VFX and of the phenomenal work we can do now visually more and more easily, the core that we see is the interaction of a family at dinner and how much we can relate to that no matter where we are in the world. That's, of course, favorite movie. But actually, yes, invoking the power of universal themes, as I've done earlier in the small intro, would you have some more examples in the works that you've worked on, Peilin or Sarah, that really have similar universally relatable themes, a bit like the moment at the table, that make it that it transcends whatever's very local about the movie. If we're watching Wallace and Gromit, I think you'd mentioned about how everybody would talk to their dog the same way that Wallace talks to his dog. This type of connection that really draws it globally.
Yeah, I think Shaun the Sheep is probably the one that's most globally well known, and because that's a big fan base in Japan and China as well, and Europe and America getting more so. And I think the US audience has grown since it was on Netflix, and and Prime and various streamers have helped people find Shaun the Sheep. And yet another show like Morph perhaps isn't so widely known. So, and that has universal themes and slapstick and things like that. So it's interesting why one has had more success than another. And I think every culture has their version of a farm and a farmer and a flock of sheep that are a bit unruly and a bit naughty and don't, the middle management layer of bits of the dog, there's a lot of people that can identify with that. So that, for Aardman, is probably the family at the table, the sort of hierarchy of the sheep, the naughty sheep, the dog, the pigs that are the ones that are always kind of causing havoc, and the nemesis of Sean. So, and it all speaks to how we work. We always start with character, and that we don't really think about plot first. So the stories come from the characters first, and they drive the incentives and the dynamics and the goals, the missions. It's all from character, and I think that's probably true to the very early formation of animation. When you think of the Fleischer and Disney, they both approach character in very different ways, but character first.
Right. Yes. Oh, it's so interesting. Also, Aardman focuses on like kind of these unexpected, or actually animation, successful animation, global animation. From what I know is it's often has a lot of elements of the unexpected in terms of the relationship between characters. And in Shaun the Sheep, it's a little unexpected that the dog is essentially running the farm for the farmer. And this is something that comes up in a lot of films, that it's that aspect of the unexpected, and having a character that can speak that's relatable, across the world, and in ways that we all kind of react to. So, and Peilin, you have anything to add?
Well, one example I was thinking of is Mulan, and how this girl is trying to figure out who she is and what she can contribute and how she belongs in the world. And I feel like that's a super universal idea, kind of coming of age, that, regardless of what culture you're from, you go through at some point. And I think that it's interesting because in the production of that film, there was a lot of time trying to figure out who is this character about. And prior to that, a lot of Disney films, the character had a very clear want from the beginning. I want whatever it was they were seeking. And it was one of the first times that a character was explored that actually wasn't sure what she wanted and wasn't sure who she is. And I remember there was a lot of conversation about, like, is that okay? Can we do that? And it turned out, I think, to be one of the most relatable things about the film, and that made it really universal. I think that, and the fact that she would do anything to protect her family, take care of her family, which motivated what she ended up doing, were probably the two more universal themes of the film.
Okay, and Chris, anything to add?
Well, I was going to ask if a lot of these films, or a lot of the films that you mentioned, or television programs, long-form television programs like Shaun the Sheep, obviously the value of silence, and I think a lot of the dogs' clipboard, everything is very visual, if I remember everything. So
no dialogue.
Yeah,
no
so
written dialogue.
So I think Shaun the Sheep and its use of its exploitation of animation as a medium in and of itself is also the thing that makes it perfect to kind of move around the world. But if a lot of these films that you're mentioning are kind of, or television programs, are a part of that tension between the local and the global, and these universal themes and these sort of, I don't want to say that the culturally specific elements of the details, because I think that's wrong, but if I'm allowed to ask a question, do you think the universal themes support the cultural specificity, or do you think the cultural specificity supports the universal themes, or can you not unpack them?
I think it goes down to the authenticity of the detail, and when you're representing a culture. So there's a clip, and it's not out yet, but there's in Wallace and Gromit, there's a telephone on the desk, and it's a particular sort of grey turquoise that's like from the 60s, 70s, and I really remember that that colour of, and it's exactly right, the colour. And, you know, some of the audiences probably don't even know what a telephone is because it's like got squirrely cable and it's plugged into the wall. It's not a mobile, but that absolute attention to detail makes you believe this is a real world that we've created, and you feel sort of safe in that world because it feels authentic, and so you buy into the characters and you can relate to equivalents in your culture.
So those kind of specifics are kind of that they allow you to buy into the bigger themes. Yeah.
Because it feels real that way.
Well, going your point about kind of why Morph versus Shaun the Sheep, I think world building. I think Shaun the Sheep's world is incredible, and maybe that's that people buy into a world. This is going to be boring now, but like the kind of fictional world. You know, if you create a fictional world, you can work on the basis that each individual text is just a world that's organised itself into a series of stories, and that's how Shaun the Sheep exactly has. I think that's the reason.
Yeah, it's maybe immersive in the way that if you did a sort of sci-fi adventure, no one can relate to the details of that, except that there's a sort of universal alien planet, and a particular filmmaker might visualize it in a certain way, but then you want the characters to feel authentic. You need you need to trust the filmmakers with your attention, because if you don't, you sort of lose that suspension of disbelief.
I remember in Abominable, we had initially, it's set in Shanghai, we had initially metal garbage cans like you see a lot in the US, because that was kind of the experience. And there are a few in Shanghai, but not that many. And when we previewed the film in China, it really stood out. People were like, what are those garbage cans? We've never seen that before. And so DreamWorks did actually incur the cost to go back, and we changed all the garbage cans because it was just a moment that kind of like took you out of the movie. It was really important.
Well, that's the idea of the national being this framework. The national is something, and cultural specificity is this kind of, in some ways, inevitable lens through which you look at all these products and go, well, that just doesn't look. You know things when they don't look right. That's why the earliest computer animation doesn't do humans, because everyone knows what a human looks like. so you know, and the software is able to do plastic and stuff like that. So you're aware that if it doesn't look right, the audience is gonna take you out of the world. So all these little details have to be,
It's so actually that reminds me the ways that adjustments to a final animated feature sometimes is culturally specific. They might adjust an element to match the sort of what's accepted culturally in that culture. As I think we discussed this previously, actually, I'd love to bring it on. This idea that sometimes when creating a film for a global audience, we'll need to make slight tweaks even to the final cut to make sure that it resonates the right way. And Chris, I think from your experience on research on Pixar and
well, I used to teach a class where we sort of examined films in terms of the advertising, and I think a good example is, which is not an animation, but I think it was the Wolverine and the American poster versus I think the Chinese poster, and it was what it was doing, because I think it's the Japanese poster because he becomes like a samurai or something, and the way that the film was advertised just across these different, just immediately tells you, okay, this is what the film is leaning on and pulling kind of stuff out. And this maybe goes back to your point about reanimation for different kinds of audiences and tweaking. I think that there are a number of examples where certain sequences are reanimated. This goes back to the 30s. I think they changed. I think when the birds in Snow White drop the pastry and it creates a word on a pie, I think that word changed depending on which part of the world you watch the film, which therefore raises the question, what's the original? Because everybody is seeing a particular version of the film that feels quite tailored. And of course there kind of is a quote-unquote original, but it does play with the idea that these films are always already kind of quite unstable, because there are bits, whether it's Inside Out changing pizza toppings depending on what children hate in different parts of the world, or I think it's Zootopia where they changed the newsreader to a particular animal that is kind of specific to that part of the world again. So there are different iterations of these films, which I think is part of the pleasure of them, like the different ways. And if you're working at a university and you're teaching a bunch of students and you play a clip from a film and they say, well, that wasn't in the version that I saw as a child. So that I find really interesting, the different versions of a film that are really playing out through these kind of culturally specific details.
Yeah, but do we always have to do that? Like, I was chatting with someone from Netflix last night who was talking about a script for an adult comedy that was British writer, and they'd used the word plonker.
Yeah.
And, obviously in the US, maybe not everyone knows what plonker means, but it's a funny word anyway, and, it sort of works. So they questioned it, but then let it happen. They've let plonker stay in the script, which
but I'm
should
sure
be a good outcome.
I'm sure in a way this is part of when you have a sort of the most common discourse, the most common format that we're using at any given time, whether we're talking about animation or any trend in society that's sort of accepted on board and that everybody follows. This idea that sometimes you just need to, you're still talking with the old discourse. I think this Jacques Derrida, French philosopher, quote said it, when you are bringing in something very new that no one's seen before, I'm completely paraphrasing, his quote was much more beautiful than this, you have to keep thinking in the old way as you're bringing in the new. If you bring it out too radically, it won't.
I love the way you Jacques Derrida my plonker.
Yes, exactly. So adding plonker, suddenly we're bringing in a bit more of a Britishness to the global playground.
But isn't that why, if you take a bunch of firsts, like something like Toy Story, you have the new and you have this kind of frantic these digital aesthetics, but then you ground it, we literally ground it because the action takes place down here, but you ground it in the universe, like the toys come alive narrative, which again, animation has been doing since the 20s, and is also what animation is. It's about that. It's about bringing these things that, So that's exactly Derrida and Toy Story together at last. But that's the point. You ground something in. If you're playing with something new, especially visual effects technology, Hollywood, the way that digital effects works, you ground it in something. You ground it in something spectacular. There's a reason why Jurassic Park plays with dinosaurs, because you're watching people look at the effect, but you root it in dinosaurs. So you're sort of playing, there's a real sense of kind of reflexivity to the way that I think Hollywood plays with its digital effects and computer animation, because it's aware of audiences' expectations, but it's also aware of audiences' experiences. So it's giving you something new, as you say, but it's against the backdrop of like just children playing with toys and thinking that they come alive.
Yes, yeah, that's what we tell clients who come to us worried that their style is not the universal animation style or the one that's currently the big trend, or it's not a 3D production, but if you find a way to give it something that's grounded, as you say, that's grounded in the experience of children, or if this is an adult film of adults or families, something that makes it a human story. Maybe that'll be the next. Maybe in 2030, this style will be just like Toy Story. Toy Story started the 3D. No, before that, nobody really believed in 3D. So it's there's no reason that we should have this small. I'd say it's not small-minded, it's small frame of mind where we're looking at the last 20, 30 years to determine how we should be making movies or the styles that they should have visually or in terms of story. There's always a spot to start something completely new while thinking in the way that, thinking in the old way, but bringing in new slowly. Thank you. And anything else to add on this topic? Because I'd love to move to the slide you see on the screen is just so that we can dig into a topic that I find really key to, bringing content globally and making it a success, is how do you navigate differences in ways of seeing? Despite globalization of the industry, dependent on where we are in the world, we have different core values, as we discussed before, and what we look for in a story. Some cultures value the perfectly well-crafted plot, whereas actually sometimes it's more about the feeling or the The pace is different depending on your culture and what you grew up in. How do you address those differences in trying to make a global successful film? I have Kirikou on screen because this was the Grand Prix 1999 here at Annecy by Michel Oslo. It was a collaborative production from a French filmmaker who grew up in West Africa, and he stuck very, very closely to West African forms of storytelling, the pace, the repetitive way of telling this story. The drawing style was unique to him, but it was also reflecting what he'd experienced of growing up in this culture. Here we have a huge success in France, where slow-paced films do succeed generally. This is something that we're constantly having to navigate as animation professionals, and how do you address when you're creating, for example, a very British film, Sarah? You're creating something that's where you have a reference to the Lady Killers or some of the old British films where nationally it'll really succeed, and you're pretty sure that everybody's going to love it and get the jokes, as well as the pace. How much adaptation do you need to do when you're thinking more globally?
Well, it's, we try and reach as wide an audience as possible, and it's not just people from different countries and different parts of the world. It's also, we're thinking about how can we reach, younger kids, how can we reach older families co-watching. So we're thinking about the audience all the time, and the last thing we want to do is offend an audience. And the best thing to do is bring in as broad an audience as possible. The streamers talk about 4 quadrants, and then I heard someone say 4 quadrants is not enough. I don't know how bigger we can get, but and maybe it is expanding the reach into, if you're doing a big family audience and you need that to make a feature film, you need a sort of big budget, so you need to have a big audience, but maybe it's about reaching other areas, other territories that you haven't reached before, and you try and do that with those relatable themes, the grounded comedy, the sort of observational stuff that goes beyond sort of the individual cultural storytelling, but you still keep that in for the authenticity and for the little extra bits of humour, so you can have layers of humour. But yeah, we really just want to make as many people laugh as possible, without offending anyone.
That's great. Actually, in Kirikou, there was an issue with exporting the film to the US because of the partial nudity of the characters. It really had very limited distribution, just a few cinemas. While in France, Kirikou is like every French child's hero from my generation. And the director specifically knew that this was not going to work in the US because of this not really censorship, but this regulation issue. And he decided to keep it as is, to make sure that the representation was accurate, to really honor the culture that he really respected and loved from his own childhood. And so, that's a very...
And I think as an independent filmmaker, that's great, and that should be happening, and we should be changing that narrative, because often we get these, sort of cultural sensitivities about the roles of women, or how children are perceived, and sometimes you want to push that boundary a bit, and the best way to do it is to have, like Peilin was saying, it's people from different cultures working on one film, so you're not monoculture all the time, that you have those different perspectives, and the filmmakers are navigating that in production rather than once it's out there and with the audience.
Yeah, Peilin, have you bumped into, while you're doing international co-productions, especially your co-productions with China or in Mulan, or generally having to represent a culture while creating a film that's relatable for global audiences, obviously without falling into stereotypes and have you encountered, what are some challenges you've encountered that you can speak about as a creative working on these wonderful movies, but and attempting to ensure the representation is accurate, that there's no unconscious bias, and in the same way that that we see indie films manage, and that we're seeing much more attention to today.
Sure. So one of the unique ways we approach development at Pearl is we actually had teams that were half local Chinese and half American, Chinese American, but also Caucasian Americans, and it really was kind of like a melting pot of people in the room that kind of brought their own perspectives and unique experiences. And it's really interesting, like when I was at Pearl, I lived in China for 2 years, so I saw a lot of local Chinese films, and I don't think I self-recognize like how Western my sense of storytelling is until I saw those films. And in Chinese films, like for example, you can have halfway through the movie this character introduced that you have not heard of prior to that moment, and then you just follow that character for like the next 40 minutes, and then they disappear and you never see them again, and this is totally fine, and I'm like, what is happening? But that is actually totally fine for people that grow up with that different type of storytelling sensibility. And I think also by the same token, another thing that we struggled with in terms of finding the balance, it's always about the balance, right? Is that the way that the screenwriter wrote Over the Moon, for example, Audrey Wells, she's American and lived in the US, grew up in the US, wanted to leave the ending ambiguous. Did this little girl actually go to the moon? Was it a dream? And when we tested the US, everyone was fine with that. And we shared it in China, and people were like, no, this is ridiculous. We need to know, did she go to the moon or not? So we actually, in the version for China, rewrote the ending so that there was a comment on a necklace that she had gotten on the moon. So it was clear, like, she went there, she got it there, she went to the moon. And they really, really wanted that and needed that. And so it's just such a different, like, storytelling sensibility, that people come to the table with. I will say, in terms of your question about challenges and international regulations and such, maybe some of you are familiar that Abominable had this very big controversy with a map that this little girl was using. It had a 9-dotted line denoting what part of the world belonged to part of China. And it was actually banned in a number of countries because of that. And from moment one, and a lot of people were angry because they thought we did that because we were pandering to the Chinese government. And we wanted it to be released in China, and of course we want it to be released in China, but from moment one, as someone that was kind of with it from the beginning, it was about nothing but authenticity from a filmmaker and creative standpoint, that this is a little girl, she lives in China. The only map she can buy is a map that would have that 9-dotted line. There's no way she could buy another map inside China. So, sometimes you have to make those tough choices and kind of lean into, what you believe is right. And we leaned into authenticity. And that was in it way long before we sent it to any censors. So I don't think I actually ever got to say that publicly before, so thank you.
Scoop.
Oh, that's great. And Chris, from again, the intellectual perspective, have you
The boring intellect.
Yes, the academic books that are this big perspective. When it comes to the history, historically, but also then today, how you're seeing these things evolve, the way that we are really starting to shift the way we, the freedoms that we take when it comes to representation and accuracy.
So, I mean, I suppose...
Or jumping off of Peilin.
Well, no, but I guess I'll begin with the issue of sort of censorship. I mean, I have a class on... I mean, there's scholars writing on forbidden animation, and the fact that, animation since, again, the 20s and 30s has been subject to production codes. Characters have to be redesigned. So even though they're drawn, they're no less meaningful because fantasy exists, and that's really important. So, yeah, I mean, that I think is interesting, that again, as texts move across different parts of the world or across national boundaries. There are these processes of veiling that might need to take place from the kind of top down and the impact that then has on the way that certain characters are designed. It's interesting the different ways of seeing and this idea of kind of pacing and narrative, and I think that you were saying kind of closure. It's funny that because of the influence of Hollywood as an industrial system and scholars that are writing about classical Hollywood cinema and modes of storytelling, goal-oriented protagonists, cause and effect action, all of that stuff, it means that because of that, everything else is defined in relation to that. So if it doesn't have closure, it's art cinema, or if it doesn't have easy to follow protagonists or protagonists at all, it's experimental. So all of these different things are defined in relation to something like the Hollywood, and which kind of makes sense if you think about it as an industrial system. But it means that films that play with pacing and closure and follow characters that go off on, that come in after 40 minutes and then we spend the rest of the film with them. Well, I mean, we're talking generally about audiences and kind of targets and markets, let's say, and the exportability or the marketability of national identity. But also, it's also okay if maybe the film just isn't for you. That's okay if some of the experiences that are being documented or ways of seeing the world, thinking about Pixar's recent production slate, and the way that reviewers occupy there's a particular kind of demographic that take on the role of film reviewers, and it makes perfect sense that some films aren't judged in the same way, and maybe the film's not for them, and that's also okay. So I think that the issue of audiences, maybe that goes against the sort of industry of animation generally, and obviously making money, it's a business, but at the same time, it's fine that there are films that play with storytelling and play with character and play with closure and play with experiences of 11-year-old Chinese girls. It's fine. It's okay. The film is not for you, reviewer. It's fine. The only other thing I will say, that all of those culturally specific things, we haven't really talked about this, but obviously the idea of kind of dubbing and star voices, stars and celebrities are always the manager of cultural change, whether it's deep fakes or AI or de-aging. They're the thing. If you see them do something, it's sort of okay. And so I think star voices are often an interesting way that difference is managed in the way that kind of maybe animation then moves across, what voices are preserved and then what are dubbed, and what does it mean to watch the authentic version with the subtitles. So I think stars are part of this. It's not just about the ways of seeing, but I think ways of kind of hearing as well, and the power that stars have as sort of gateways into maybe creating an audience for a film. Mm-hmm. Potentially.
Yes, just like Gad Elmaleh is Gru in Illumination's Despicable Me here in France, and that's like that's culturally something that makes French people very happy to see their favorite comedian in the film, and it's something that's changed, of course, drastically from the original.
Well, star voices went from stunt casting to kind of authenticators.
Yes.
So stars being something that animation is no longer, I think one of the quotes is something like, animation is now no longer a medium that stars turn their noses up. They kind of want to be, Hugh Jackman really wants to be in Flushed Away and stuff, that these kind, which is a brilliant movie. But like those sorts of things, I think there's some interesting, the role of the star in navigating some of these things. Anyway.
And unfortunately, we're starting to be out of time, but I want to make sure we have time for audience questions. So just before we close, any additional comments you wanted to make? Any last
just on the
points?
back of that, the film is it's not for everyone. I think that's the role of independent filmmaking, and it's a very important part of the culture. It can't all just be the dominant big features that have to be many hundreds of millions of pounds.
Yes. All right. So any questions from the audience? I think we have somebody who can bring around a microphone. Yes.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for your time. And I've really learned a lot from today's panel discussion. My question is, when talking about creating content that reflect your culture but resonate with the global audience, I want to ask this pertaining to humor, right? Because something that might be interesting and funny to your culture might not be funny to the rest of the world. So how are you able to research and find out and know that this thing that I find funny might be interesting to the rest of the world. Thank you.
I suppose there's some low-hanging fruit with physical humour, like people falling over or some, human ineptitude is generally funny across the world. And also, sometimes for us it works removing it from the human. So it's animals, so it's not a direct representation of a particular person. We can desensitize quite a lot by having it as a dog or a sheep. And maybe that's why Sean translates more than morph,
But isn't it? Don't they say it's intrinsically funnier if a king slips on a banana skin than a child?
Yeah, maybe
Like it's about character, and it goes back to what you said about building these characters.
Bodily functions always get laughs.
All right. Thank you. My name is Karen, and I'm an animator from Ghana. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much for coming. I think we have time for one more question. I'm sorry. Let's Sarah.
Greetings. Thank you all. I really appreciate this. We were talking about the localization and everything and changing, like you had mentioned, changing like the language of the like facial animation and things like that for different regions. I wanted to know is like, how feasible is that to plan for that from a creator's point of view from the beginning, to be planning for that type of extra layer or that extra rendering for China, for Japan, or for France, or Nigeria or Brazil or something like that? It's like, how do you go about making those decisions of we should do it here, but it's probably not worth doing it over there, and how feasible is that?
Well, I'll just speak to Kung Fu Panda, which is what I know the best. Just because the first two films had been so successful, there was a feeling, and kind of embraced by the country as like one of theirs, there was the feeling that that was kind of the next level of making it as hyperlocal as possible, and that it would be embraced in an even stronger way. Kind of like I said, there's really no way to know, like, did it pay off? Would it have made that much anyway without it? There's really no way to know. But I think part of the reason why they chose to do it was also the PR story of it, and Oriental DreamWorks, which became Pearl Studio, being a company focused on co-productions and a bridge between China and the US, I think that kind of had a value outside of box office as well.
Thank you very much. We're out of time, but thank you so much. Again, huge round of applause to our wonderful panel for this talk today. And thank you all again for coming. Please keep your little keeper card as well to support us. And thank you again. It's wonderful to be here, and enjoy your evening.